May 8, 1945. The Reich has collapsed. Across Europe, fires still burn in the rubble of 1,000 cities. In the final days, as Soviet artillery shells rain down on Berlin, a convoy of massive steel behemoths sits silent on railway sidings stretching from Bavaria to Czechoslovakia. These are not ordinary trains. They are mobile fortresses. 12 armored command centers that once carried the most powerful men in Nazi Germany across their crumbling empire. Each train is a rolling palace, reinforced steel walls, anti-aircraft guns mounted on flat cars, private sleeping quarters lined with mahogany and silk, communication cars packed with the most advanced radio equipment in the world. Some are still warm from their last journey. Others have been hastily abandoned, their engines cooling in the spring air, documents scattered across polished desks, half-drunk champagne bottles rolling across parquet floors. Hermann Göring's train, codenamed Asia, sits on a siding near Berchtesgaden, its cream-colored exterior now pockmarked with shrapnel. Hitler's personal command train, the Führersonderzug, was last seen near Mönchkirchen, Austria. Ribbentrop's train, Himmler's train, Speer's train, each a monument to power, now silent and vulnerable. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to these 12 luxury armored trains after the guns fell silent? To understand the fate of these trains, you must first understand what they represented. These were not mere transportation. They were mobile headquarters, symbols of absolute authority, and some of the most sophisticated mobile command centers ever constructed. Between 1937 and 1943, Nazi Germany built approximately 12 major command trains for its highest-ranking officials. The most famous was Hitler's Führersonderzug, later named America, which consisted of up to 15 cars and weighed over 1,200 tons when fully loaded. The train included 2 locomotives, multiple armored cars with 30mm steel plating, anti-aircraft positions, command centers with direct radio links to Berlin, personal quarters, a bathing car, and even a car dedicated entirely to Hitler's personal film screenings. Hermann Göring's train Asia was even more extravagant. Witnesses described walking through cars decorated with stolen art from occupied territories, a dining car that could seat 20 guests beneath crystal chandeliers, and a personal salon car where Göring held court surrounded by Renaissance paintings. The train's armor was so thick that it required 2 locomotives just to move it at acceptable speeds. Heinrich Himmler's train, the Sonderzug Steiermark, served as a mobile SS headquarters and included cells for prisoners, interrogation rooms, and direct communication lines to concentration camps across the Reich. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop's train was fitted with a complete diplomatic office suite, secure communication rooms, and quarters for a traveling staff of over 50 people. These trains weren't just symbols of luxury. They were strategic assets. From these mobile command posts, the Nazi leadership directed armies, made life-and-death decisions affecting millions, and attempted to maintain control over an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. The trains allowed them to move constantly, avoiding Allied bombing raids while staying connected to the machinery of the Third Reich. Now, in May 1945, with that empire in ashes, these trains represented something else entirely. Prizes of war, evidence of crimes, and treasure troves of intelligence. The immediate aftermath began in chaos. As German forces surrendered across multiple fronts, Allied troops found these trains abandoned in the most unexpected places. American forces from the 101st Airborne Division discovered Göring's Asia on May 6, 1945, sitting on a rail siding near the Eagle's Nest in Berchtesgaden. The train was still functional, its generators humming, electric lights burning in empty corridors. When American soldiers forced open the doors, they found a surreal scene. Göring had fled just hours earlier, leaving behind rooms full of looted artwork, cases of vintage champagne, silk uniforms hanging in wardrobes, and documents scattered everywhere. One sergeant later recalled walking through a dining car where the table was still set for dinner, crystal glasses standing upright, a meal half-eaten and already growing cold. Within 24 hours, the train became a tourist attraction for Allied soldiers. Thousands of GIs lined up to walk through the cars, taking photographs, pocketing souvenirs. Officers tried to maintain order, but the scale of the looting was impossible to control. Soldiers tore down silk curtains, pried artwork from walls, emptied wine cellars. By May 10th, intelligence officers arrived to catalogue what remained, but much had already vanished into the pockets and duffel bags of liberating troops. The train itself, however, was too large to simply disappear. Hitler's Führersonderzug met a different fate. In late April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the train was moved repeatedly, always staying just ahead of the advancing Red Army. On April 25th, the train sat in a tunnel near Mönchkirchen, Austria, camouflaged with netting and tree branches. The skeleton crew of railway workers and SS guards knew the end was near. When American forces from the Third Army arrived on May 5th, they found the train partially destroyed. The SS guards had set demolition charges in the communication cars and command centers, destroying the most sensitive equipment before fleeing. But the passenger cars, the luxury quarters, the dining rooms, these remained intact, frozen in time. Lieutenant Robert Morrison of the U.S. Army was among the first to enter Hitler's personal car. In his diary, he described a space more luxurious than any hotel he'd ever seen. The Führer's bedroom featured a large bed with silk sheets, still unmade from its last use. A private bathroom had marble fixtures and gold-plated taps. The office car contained maps spread across tables, pins still marking front-line positions that no longer existed. Most chilling were the small details: reading glasses left on a desk, a half-smoked cigar in an ashtray, a calendar frozen on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. Morrison wrote that the train felt like a ghost ship on rails, a perfectly preserved monument to a regime that had ceased to exist just days earlier. The Soviet capture of Nazi command trains followed a different pattern. When Red Army forces swept through Poland and eastern Germany, they seized at least 4 of the 12 luxury trains before Western forces could reach them. Himmler's Sonderzug Steiermark was captured near Prague on May 9th, still carrying files from SS headquarters. Soviet intelligence officers descended on the train like archaeologists at a fresh dig. Every document was photographed, every file catalogued. The Russians understood the intelligence value immediately. These trains contained years of records, communication logs, and operational documents that revealed the inner workings of the Nazi leadership. But the Soviets also recognized another value: the trains themselves were valuable industrial assets. The Soviet railway system had been devastated by the German invasion. Tens of thousands of locomotives and cars had been destroyed. Here were fully functional, heavily built trains with advanced technology. Within weeks, Soviet railway engineers began dismantling certain cars, shipping components back to the USSR. The armored locomotives were particularly prized. Their thick steel plating and powerful engines made them ideal for reconstruction work. By July 1945, at least 2 of the captured trains had been completely disassembled, their parts absorbed into the Soviet railway network. The British captured 2 trains in northern Germany, including one belonging to Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister. British intelligence was particularly interested in Speer's train because it contained detailed production records and plans for German war industries. When British officers entered the train near Hamburg on May 4th, they found an entire car converted into a mobile drafting office with architectural plans still pinned to drawing boards. Another car held scale models of unrealized buildings, monuments to a 1,000-year Reich that lasted just 12 years. The British methodically photographed everything before shipping the most important documents to London. The train itself sat on a siding for months, guarded but unused, slowly rusting in the North Sea rain. The destruction phase began in earnest by autumn 1945. The Allied powers faced a massive problem: what to do with thousands of pieces of German military equipment. The trains were particularly problematic. They were too large to hide, too expensive to maintain, and too symbolic to simply leave intact. The Allied Control Council, which governed occupied Germany, issued a directive in August 1945. All Nazi command trains were to be either destroyed or stripped of any military capability. The reasoning was both practical and symbolic. These trains could never be allowed to serve as rallying points for any Nazi resurgence. They had to disappear. Imagine standing in a railway yard outside Frankfurt in October 1945. Rows of German railway equipment stretch to the horizon. Among them sit pieces of the once mighty command trains. Workers with cutting torches move methodically through the cars, slicing through steel plating, separating valuable metals from worthless interiors. The luxury fittings, the silk, the wood paneling, the crystal, are torn out and burned. What remains are steel carcasses, stripped and dead. By November, huge piles of scrap metal accumulate, waiting to be melted down and reformed into something new, something peaceful. The armored plates that once protected Nazi leaders are destined to become building materials for a shattered Europe. Göring's Asia train met this fate. After the initial looting and intelligence gathering, American authorities decided the train was too damaged and too symbolic to preserve. In September 1945, demolition crews began systematically destroying it. The anti-aircraft cars were cut apart first, their guns removed and destroyed separately. The luxury passenger cars were stripped of anything valuable, then the steel frames were cut into manageable pieces. By December 1945, nothing remained but scrap metal. The train that once carried the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany had been reduced to anonymous chunks of steel, indistinguishable from any other scrap pile in occupied Germany. Hitler's Führersonderzug suffered a similar fate, but with a twist. American forces initially preserved several cars for intelligence purposes and as potential evidence for war crimes trials. Throughout 1946, investigators pored over every inch of the train, looking for documents, hidden compartments, anything that might provide evidence of Nazi crimes. They found plenty: communication logs detailing military operations, orders bearing Hitler's signature, even fragments of correspondence discussing the Holocaust. But the train itself had witnessed too much evil to be allowed to survive. In early 1947, the order came down: destroy it completely. Unlike Göring's train, which was simply scrapped, Hitler's train was demolished with theatrical finality. Explosive charges were set, and the remaining cars were blown apart in a series of controlled detonations. Newsreel cameras captured the moment for posterity. The message was clear: the physical symbols of Nazi power were being erased from the earth. But not all 12 trains met this fate. This is where the story becomes strange, where documented history gives way to persistent rumors and occasional shocking discoveries. At least 3 of the luxury trains simply vanished from official records between 1945 and 1947. They were logged as captured, moved to various locations, and then nothing. No destruction orders, no transfer records, no final disposition. They disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. One of these phantom trains belonged to Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. Captured by American forces near Salzburg, the train was moved to a military railway yard in Munich in June 1945. Intelligence officers examined it, removed documents, and photographed everything. Then it sat, guarded and gradually forgotten, as personnel rotated and bureaucratic attention shifted elsewhere. By 1947, when Allied authorities began accounting for all captured Nazi equipment, Ribbentrop's train was gone. The guards couldn't say when it left or where it went. Some documents suggested it might have been shipped to France as part of war reparations. but French authorities had no record of receiving it. The train had simply evaporated. The most persistent mystery involves a train believed to have belonged to an SS logistics officer named Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, who oversaw the economic administration of the concentration camp system. This train was smaller than the Reich leadership trains, but still luxurious, still armored, still valuable. It was last documented in Soviet-occupied Czechoslovakia in August 1945. Czech railway workers reported seeing it moved under Soviet guard towards the border. Then silence. Decades later, in 1987, a retired Soviet railway engineer gave an interview to a German newspaper, claiming the train had been shipped to Siberia and converted into a mobile command post for Soviet railway construction projects. He said he'd worked on it personally in the early 1950s, stripping out the German fittings and replacing them with Soviet equipment. The train allegedly operated in Siberia until the 1960s, then was finally scrapped. But without official Soviet records, most of which remain classified, this story cannot be verified. The reuse and repurposing of components from these trains is better documented. The powerful locomotives that pulled the command trains were too valuable to destroy. These were some of the finest heavy locomotives in the world, capable of pulling enormous loads at relatively high speeds. The Soviets kept at least 6 of these locomotives, redesignating them and putting them to work hauling freight across the reconstructed western USSR. American forces transferred several locomotives to French and Belgian railways as part of rebuilding European infrastructure. A locomotive that once pulled Göring's luxury train ended its career in the 1960s hauling coal in Belgium, its origins unknown to the workers who maintained it. Even more surprising is what happened to some of the luxury fittings. The wood paneling, artwork, and furnishings from several trains were salvaged before demolition. American and British officers claimed these as legitimate war souvenirs or sold them through official channels. In estate sales across America in the 1950s and 60s, pieces of Nazi command trains occasionally appeared. A mahogany panel here, a light fixture there, sometimes even larger pieces like entire sections of dining car furniture. Most buyers had no idea what they were purchasing. In 1978, an antique dealer in Pennsylvania bought an ornate wooden sideboard at an estate sale. Only years later, when examining it closely, did he find a small brass plate on the back marked Deutsche Reichsbahn-Sonderzug 1939. Research confirmed it came from one of the Nazi command trains. Today it sits in a private collection, a strange and uncomfortable piece of history. The rare survivors, the actual intact remnants of these trains, are almost non-existent. But almost is not quite the same as none. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, researchers gained access to railway museums in Russia and Ukraine. In a museum storage facility outside St. Petersburg, they found a single railway car in remarkably good condition. The car had no markings, no identification plates, nothing to indicate its origin. But the construction was unusual. 30mm steel plating, armored glass windows, fittings that matched no standard Soviet design. Experts examined every detail. The conclusion was startling. This was a communication car from one of the Nazi command trains, preserved either deliberately or by accident, forgotten in storage for nearly 50 years. The car had been stripped of all internal equipment, but the basic structure remained. The steel showed the quality of German wartime metallurgy. Bolt patterns matched photographs of known command train cars. Most tellingly, hidden beneath layers of Soviet paint, conservators found traces of the original color scheme, the distinctive gray-green used on Nazi military trains. The car now sits in a Russian railway museum, labeled simply as German Armored Railway Car, 1940s. Museum staff believe it came from Himmler's train, captured in 1945 and eventually transferred to museum storage in the 1960s. Why it survived when all others were destroyed remains unclear. Perhaps a Soviet railway official recognized its historical value. Perhaps it was simply forgotten. Either way, it stands as possibly the only substantial physical remnant of the 12 luxury trains. An even stranger story emerged from the forests of Poland in 2015. Local historians investigating wartime railway sites discovered an abandoned siding deep in the woods near Wałbrzych. The siding had been covered by 70 years of vegetation growth. Using ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, they found the rusted remains of railway cars buried under soil and vegetation. The site was carefully excavated. What they found were pieces of at least 2 railway cars, corroded beyond recognition, but still identifiable by their construction. The heavy steel plating, the layout, the dimensions, all matched command train specifications. Documents in local archives suggested this might have been an emergency evacuation point where damaged train cars were left behind in the final days of the war, then forgotten. The site was too remote, too hidden for post-war scrappers to find. The forest had simply swallowed it. These discoveries raise unsettling questions. If one car survived in Russia, if remnants lie hidden in Polish forests, what else might still exist? In the chaos of 1945, with millions of refugees streaming across Europe, with entire armies dissolving, with bureaucracies collapsing, could entire trains have simply been lost? Could they be sitting in forgotten rail yards, buried in forest sidings, hidden in tunnels sealed decades ago? Treasure hunters certainly think so. Every few years, someone claims to have found another Nazi train, usually based on deathbed confessions or old maps or ground-penetrating radar readings. Most claims prove false, but not all. The legacy of these trains extends beyond their physical fate. They served as mobile stages for some of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. From these luxury cars, orders went out that moved armies, destroyed cities, ended millions of lives. Hitler traveled over 10,000 kilometers by train during the war, conducting military conferences from his mobile headquarters, making decisions that shaped the course of history. The trains were witnesses to evil on an industrial scale, yet they were also precisely that: industrial products, marvels of engineering, examples of German technological prowess turned toward monstrous purposes. In museums today, we preserve far less significant objects from World War II: uniforms, weapons, documents, propaganda posters, all carefully catalogued and displayed so future generations can understand what happened. Yet the trains, which were among the most important physical artifacts of Nazi leadership, were almost entirely obliterated. This was deliberate. In 1945, Allied authorities faced a choice: preserve these trains as historical evidence or destroy them as dangerous symbols. They chose destruction, and perhaps wisely. The trains were too grand, too impressive, too easily transformed into shrines for those who might wish to resurrect the ideology they represented. But destruction came at a cost. We lost physical evidence of how the Nazi leadership actually lived and worked. We lost the ability to walk through these spaces and understand viscerally what they represented. Photographs exist, documents survive, but the tactile reality is gone. Future historians must reconstruct this world from paper records and fading memories rather than from the objects themselves. This is the bargain we made: safety in exchange for historical loss. The workers who cut apart these trains in 1945 and 1946 probably gave little thought to historical preservation. They saw symbols of a hated regime, valuable scrap metal, and jobs that needed doing. They worked with cutting torches in railway yards across defeated Germany, methodically disassembling what had once seemed invincible. The work was hard, dirty, and physically demanding. The armored steel didn't cut easily. It required hours of work to reduce a single car to manageable pieces. Multiply that by dozens of cars across multiple trains, and you begin to understand the sheer industrial effort required to make these trains disappear. Some of the workers were former concentration camp prisoners, assigned by Allied authorities to help dismantle the machinery of their own oppression. Imagine being a survivor of Auschwitz, assigned to cut apart Himmler's train. What thoughts would run through your mind as you sliced through steel that once protected the man who administered the camp system? Would it feel like justice, revenge, or just another exhausting day of work in a world still struggling to make sense of what had happened? We have few records of what these workers thought or felt. They were hired to do a job, they did it, and then they moved on with their lives in a continent trying desperately to rebuild. By 1950, the work was essentially complete. Of the 12 luxury armored trains that carried Nazi high command across Europe, nothing substantial remained except scattered components, hidden archives, and one forgotten car in a Soviet storage facility. The locomotives had been repurposed, the steel melted down, the luxury fittings dispersed or destroyed. The trains had been erased as completely as possible from physical reality, though not from memory. Today, if you visit the German Railway Museum in Nuremberg, you'll find a small exhibit on Nazi-era railway operations. There are photographs of the command trains, documents describing their construction, testimonies from people who worked on them or saw them. But no actual trains, no cars, no substantial physical remnants. The exhibit includes a panel explaining what happened to them after the war, ending with a simple statement. These symbols of dictatorship and war were destroyed to prevent their misuse. Only fragments remain. Those fragments occasionally surface. In 2008, a construction crew in Vienna unearthed a buried railway siding while excavating for a new building. Among the debris, they found pieces of armored plating and fittings that experts identified as likely coming from a Nazi command train. The items were catalogued and sent to a museum. In 2012, a metal detector enthusiast in Bavaria found decorative brass fixtures in a field that turned out to be from a luxury railway car. Research traced them to components from Ribbentrop's train, probably discarded by scrappers in the late 1940s. These small discoveries continue, tiny pieces of a puzzle that was deliberately broken apart 75 years ago. The question of what happened to these 12 trains is, in the end, a question about how societies deal with the physical remnants of evil. Do we preserve them as warnings, as educational tools, as evidence, or do we destroy them to prevent them from becoming symbols of resurrection, rallying points for those who refuse to learn from history? The Allies chose destruction, perhaps necessarily so. In 1945, with Nazi ideology still warm, with millions of Germans still loyal to the fallen regime, preserving these magnificent trains might have been too dangerous. Better to destroy them completely, to turn them into anonymous scrap, to ensure they could never inspire another generation of followers. But we can still walk through the past in other ways. We have the photographs that American soldiers took in May 1945, wandering through Göring's train with their cameras. We have the intelligence reports cataloguing every detail. We have the testimonies of survivors who saw these trains arrive at concentration camps, carrying the men who ordered their deaths. We have the railway workers' logs documenting every journey. The trains themselves are gone, but the evidence of what they represented, what they enabled, what they witnessed, this cannot be destroyed. In the end, these 12 trains were more than just luxurious transportation. They were mobile command centers from which a continent was devastated, from which orders flowed that ended millions of lives, from which men insulated themselves in comfort while the world burned outside their armored windows. Their destruction was not just practical but necessary, a symbolic severing of the physical connection to a regime that industrialized murder and dressed it in silk and mahogany. The trains are gone, melted down into bridge girders and building materials, repurposed into locomotives hauling coal, dispersed into 1,000 fragments scattered across museums and private collections. But their story remains, a reminder that even the most imposing symbols of power are ultimately temporary, that regimes that seem invincible can collapse in days, and that the physical monuments to tyranny can be erased far more easily than the memories of those who suffered under it. The 12 luxury armored trains of Nazi high command rolled into history, and then, deliberately and methodically, were rolled back out of physical existence, leaving behind only photographs, documents, and the cautionary tale of what happens when technological sophistication serves monstrous ideology.